Hi, everyone. Good morning. Really glad to have you here today. I would like to go ahead and introduce today's speakers. However, before I introduce them, I wanted to let you know that we now have Kay Ledbetter with us, and she is going to be interpreting for the first about half hour of this webinar. And then we'll be joined by Rosie Donenworth, who will finish our interpreting for the remainder of the webinar. Today's speakers are Dr. Leandra Clark-Harvey, Dr. Jay Africa, and ANDRÉ CHAPMAN. Dr. Harvey is the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs for the California Council of Community Behavioral Health Agencies. She previously served as Chief Consultant to the California State Assembly Committee on Business and Professions, Principal Consultant to the Senate Committee on Business, Professions, and Economic Development, and a Health Policy Consultant to the Office of former Senator Curran D. Price, Jr. Prior to her work within the California legislature, she completed her PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. She completed her pre-doctoral fellowship at the University of Southern California Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Los Angeles Mattel Children's Hospital. She's maintained an impressive record of leadership, including serving on national and local boards, including her current position on the American Psychological Association, and prior positions on the Association of Black Psychologists, Sacramento County Public Health Advisory Board, Sacramento County Children's Coalition, and the Los Angeles VU Park section of the National Council of Negro Women. She's a member of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, Sacramento chapter, and is a fellow of the American Leadership Forum and the Jaime Emerging Leaders Program. Dr. Jay Africa is the Director of Behavioral Health and Recovery Services at the County of Marin. An experienced clinician and innovative thought leader and strategist, Dr. Africa is passionate about integrating effective, culturally responsive practices into the core function of county health services. An activist and a storyteller at heart, Jay believes that love and justice are essential ingredients in helping people thrive and collectively transforming communities. ANDRÉ CHAPMAN is the founder and the CEO of Unity Group Care Incorporated. In 1992, as the National Director of Sales and disheartened by the lack of minorities in the technology field, ANDRÉ B. CHAPMAN redirected his focus, and he founded Unity Care Group Incorporated with the goal of developing educational and social programs designed to enrich the lives of underserved youth. As founder and CEO, Mr. CHAPMAN's personal mission is to change the foster care system. So together we will ensure equality, transparency, and access for underserved and marginalized communities of color. Mr. CHAPMAN has earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Business, a Master's in Organizational Management, and a Certificate of Completion from the Harvard Business School, Strategic Perspectives on Nonprofit Management. Mr. CHAPMAN has received numerous awards of distinction and commendation honoring his tireless dedication and community involvement. He serves on a variety of local, county, and state boards and commissions, is a fellow of the American Leadership Forum. He's a national presenter on creating effective, efficient, and culturally proficient services for communities of color and continues to work diligently to advocate on behalf of foster youth to enact change in the policies and practices of the child welfare system, mental health system, and juvenile justice system. And with that, I would like to go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Leandra Clark-Harvey.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone. I'm actually the new CEO of the California Council of Community Behavioral Health Agencies, and I'd like to thank DHCS and CIBHS for including CBHA today. As an introduction, I'd like to share a little bit about my story, why I'm here, and I'll share a little bit about my personal family history and how it's really influenced my career path. So I come from a family of what I call strong faith and action. And I'll illustrate this by sharing a quick story. Next slide. So many of you are familiar with the story of Ruby Bridges, who helped desegregate New Orleans public schools in 1960. But what you may not know is that on that very same day, across town, 3 other little 6-year-old girls, the McDonough 3, were also integrating McDonough 19 public school. And one of these little girls is pictured in the top right of the slide with a big white bow in her hair and huge eyes as she stared out at the mob of parents and folks that were in opposition to her integrating the school that day. And her name is Gail Etienne. Gail is my cousin, my mother's first cousin. So I grew up with these stories of bravery and pushing back against the system and really fighting for others. And I think that it shows up in the work that I do. But I'll share that despite the fact that I'm educated and I'm frankly privileged, I'm still seen as a young Black woman. Next slide. So I'm a psychologist, and I happen to sit on the board of the American Psychological Association. Just 2 years ago, I was in Washington, D.C. at some fancy hotel after a board meeting, and I was 8 months pregnant, casually dressed, and I was waiting at the elevator, and a man who was at the meeting walked up to me and said, "Oh, I didn't know that staff was allowed to stay at the hotel with members." You know, it didn't matter that I had a PhD or that my peers elected me to this position. He just saw me as a young Black pregnant woman at the elevator who must have been there to work for him during his meeting. So I tell you this story to reinforce that no matter the education, the honors, the microaggressions that racially and ethnically diverse leaders and individuals in general experience are real. And I carry that with me as I do the work of advocacy on behalf of people who have not been afforded the privilege of good education and don't have a platform to inform the world about their plights. So I take it on as my responsibility to tell their stories and to fix the system that they live in. And I really look forward to talking more about that system in a few minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. First, I want to just acknowledge the land that I am on, and it belongs to the Coast Miwok Indians. One of the stories that I want to tell is that I am, a family member of folks that have mental health and substance abuse. And that really sort of frames the world that I see. That I do this work in behavioral health because I have been affected both professionally and personally by them. I grew up in the Philippines in the 70s. I was 2 years old when martial law was imposed. And that has reminded me of how important freedom is, and how when one's freedom and your ability to be independent is contained, and that how really it impacts your mental health and your ability to thrive. But when I was in my teens, in 1986, People Power happened, and really saw how people and communities can come together to fight for what is right and justice, and for justice. And in those moments, I realized that people coming together because they love each other and they love freedom can really make an impact looking out for each other. And it really stayed for me as I been able to come to the United States, hopefully have a better life for me and my family. And that's sort of the lens that I see the world. That's the heart that I bring to this work. And every day I think about what I can do to help change people's stories, as I have been given the opportunity for my life to have changed for the better. And it's really my hope that some of the stories that I tell are impacting folks, that actually in the end, it's really about love and justice that really matters. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to share my journey. My name is ANDRÉ CHAPMAN. I come to you kind of through a different pathway. I started Unicare in the early 90s. I was 10 years old at the time when I started the organization, but I stand on the shoulders of my great-grandfather, William Randolph Herring, who was a slave. He was a product of rape. My grandfather, who was a pastor, my mother, who's a teacher, and my father, who In 1968, decided to move us from Florida to California. So I grew up in a community called Palo Alto, and many of you know Palo Alto is one of the most expensive places to live on the planet. My mom taught in East Palo Alto since 1968. East Palo Alto is a freeway separated from Palo Alto about 50 feet apart, but economically oceans apart. Under-resourced. In the 80s, it was the murder capital of the United States, had no banks, no grocery stores, high in poverty. So I found myself navigating between both worlds, the only Black kid in most of my classes, having friends that had trust funds, but then going across the freeway and seeing a community that looked like me, but struggling to have food on the table. And that painted a clear picture for me of the have and have nots. I also grew up in the deaf community. My older sister is deaf, and I saw many of the same challenges of the community, tremendously underserved. Went to San Jose State, began a career in high tech. And while working, I stumbled upon a group home. I had no idea anything about foster care, except that when I left for college, my mom became a foster parent. So I have a 10-year-old sister that came into our life when I was 18, that I never asked her journey, but after I stumbled upon this group home working in tech, I came back and I asked her about her journey through foster care, and I found out about the horrific outcomes of kids in foster care. So I wanted to start a program where I could get kids connected to technology, at the same time provide housing and a secure place to living for young folks. So we opened our group home on August 14th, 1993. And over the years we grew. I stayed in my tech career, but I looked at this as my ministry of giving back. I felt this is where God showed up and wanted me to do something to give back to young folks. The organization grew over the 27 years from one staff to over 200 employees, one youth serving more than 7,000 youth and families per year. And over those 27 years, I've seen a lot. You know, how we as providers and our system partners have failed our Black and brown communities. And one of my favorite authors is Peter Block, who wrote the book called Structure of Belonging. And he talks about systems, and systems are capable of service, but not care. So most clients can give you a laundry list of services, but are unable to articulate what has fundamentally changed in their life. Next slide. So there are many well-intentioned people who work in this field. You can go to the next one. And this is one of my favorite slides, Albert Einstein. And you can read it because this is a place that really reflects where we all are today and what we need to think about how we show up different. And like I said, there's a lot of well-intentioned folks in this field, but lack the fortitude, the understanding, the appreciation for how the legacy of discrimination is embedded in every fiber of our structures, of our systems. And that lack of action perpetuates racism, it re-traumatizes families all the time. And so I've always been a little bit perplexed by how communities understand the value of a customer, a paying customer, particularly when companies understand that's their number one priority. But in our industry of human services, we don't truly understand the value in that same manner. Next slide, please. So it's no surprise that when we think about the levels of trauma within our Black and brown communities, particularly right now, is at an all-time high. Ineffective systems of care must reimagine the new normal, no different from our police departments. The issues aren't just about problems with our police. It's the whole system of care that is hyper-focused on the deficits of our communities and our clients versus the gifts, the strengths, the values. So when we think about this work today, the legacy of discrimination, the years of social inequalities that result in racial disparities, we think about what I call the backpacks of trauma. Next slide, please. You know, this has made our communities more susceptible to the chronic and debilitating diseases such as COVID-19. So think about COVID-19, and it's killing Black folks at 3.8 times higher than white people. 1 in every 1,000 Black American has died. And so now we're seeing the rise in the Latinx community. So at Unity Care, we've launched an initiative called COVID-19 Black to help reduce the spread of this virus. But more than anything, in this current context, you add the racial attacks from the assassination of Ahmaud Arbery, the Amy Cooper who weaponized her whiteness to call the police on Christian Cooper, and then the senseless killings of Breonna Taylor, and then we saw the gut-wrenching murder of George Floyd, and we saw the uprise of our community that says enough is enough. So today I'm excited about the conversation about race and racism and anti-Black racism. It's more critical today than any other time in our history. If I think back to My parents talked about civil rights. My grandmother talked about Jim Crow. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today and educating and having a courageous dialogue about how we show up different as leaders in this system that we work within.
Ellie, you can move to the next slide, and Leandra's coming on. Great.
All right, so thank you. Thank you for dialing in again, and thank you to my colleagues for sharing their personal stories. I've shared about myself and my passion and the discrimination that I've encountered as a leader, but I really haven't shared about what brought me to this work ultimately. So I'm a psychologist, and I worked with children, youth, and families in Los Angeles. And prior to that, I worked as a licensed professional counselor for about 6 years in Madison, Wisconsin. So I've always had a heart for working with disenfranchised populations, but I felt increasingly frustrated by the inability to get good therapeutic work done because of the barriers that prevented my clients from getting the care that they needed. So this clinical work and passion really informed my ultimate desire to understand the systems that were impacting the clients that I worked with. And ultimately, I transitioned to policy and advocacy because of the disparities I saw while working in clinical practice. Next slide. So I wanted to move from what ecological theory teaches us is the microsystem, which is really the focus on the individual and their environment, to the macro system, which is the focus on systems and policies that shape the environment that many of our clients live in. Next slide. And now, as a CEO of CBHA, I've had the privilege of representing agencies that do the work that I used to do and are often serving clients with high needs and low resources. So let's talk about the system that we're all working and living within. So in general, we understand that there are striking disparities when you examine access to services and disproportionate representation of racially and ethnically populations. This slide lays it out here. There's a lack of access to mental health services. These clients are less likely to receive the needed care. They're more likely to receive poor quality care when treated, and there's a delay or a fail to seek mental health treatment. We know that when we talk about Blacks, that they're more likely to terminate treatment prematurely. And after entering care, they're less likely to receive the best available treatments for depression and anxiety. Those are issues that have existed prior to COVID-19. But are only exacerbated by the racial pandemic that we're experiencing right now. Next slide. And when we examine these charts, we can see that Blacks and Latinos lead in rates of psychological distress and unmet needs. These are state statistics. This is California. This is not okay. Next slide. And here's what we know about the system in California specifically, and in particular as it pertains to the Medi-Cal population. So 70% are members of racial and ethnically diverse group, 40% identify that their primary language is not English. We know that there's 10.9 million enrollees and over 3/4 are racially ethnically diverse. Latinx populations make up half the enrollees, and they have the second lowest rate of access to mental health treatment. These continue to be problems when we look at the state picture. So what does this mean for you? Well, many of you are leaders and clinicians in counties across the state, and it's critical to understand how benign interactions and decisions can lead to poor health outcomes for racially and ethnically diverse clients. And the work has to be intentional. So understanding the levels of racism is a start. Because racism and bias are prominent and problematic issues in society, it's vital that we all become aware of how they work and how they can show up in seemingly innocuous places. There are so many subtle behaviors, and often we don't recognize when our own privilege and our own implicit bias is at play. Importantly, these are phenomena that we're not born with. We learn them. And that's why it's important to move towards unlearning and re-educating ourselves. Next slide. So in this next slide, you're going to see a chart that I like because it illustrates the different forms of racism and how they must manifest. And next slide. Stay with me a moment while I revisit individual racism, which is on the left. Please go back one slide. Individual racism is on the left. And one component of individual racism is what is called on this chart personal racism, which is also implicit bias. This is a very dangerous thing, and it's gained a lot of attention in the past decade. So these biases are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. They reside deep in the subconscious, and these associations develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning at a very early age through exposure to direct and indirect messages. So when people are acting out of their implicit bias, they're not even aware that their actions are biased. In fact, those biases may be in direct conflict with their own personal beliefs and values. Next slide. So here's an example. Go back one, please. When this children's workbook was released, there was an outcry about the page which depicts white kids as happy achievers and brown children as sad or angry. Now, when the publisher realized this, they stopped production immediately, and then they issued a statement indicating that it was completely unintentional. They were actually shocked that the assignment of faces to emotions played out in this manner. So, when a police officer holds a belief that Blacks are more likely to be guilty of crimes, that thugs wear hoodies, and that protesters just want to destroy property and loot, that will definitely impact the split-second judgment calls that he or she makes in the field when they're dispatched to protect the public. And when a therapist has biases about how poor Black people parent and has to make a decision about who or what program to refer a child or family to, those implicit biases may impact the decisions that are ultimately made. So a few months ago, I was with my children, and I heard the flight attendant say, in case of emergency, put my mask on first and then assist them with theirs. That's why it's imperative that the self-work begins with leaders in order to become a change agent before you can lead other people. And we know that research tells us that there are some strategies that you can employ at your agencies to move towards providing optimal clinical services. Next slide. So one strategy is diversifying your workforce. Just the mere presence of others is important. It's not the solution, but it's a start. We also know that clients who participate in racial and ethnic concordant relationships are more likely to use health services, less likely to postpone or delay seeking care, and that they report overall greater satisfaction and greater outcomes and better communication. Next, we know that education and training for providers is essential. So doing that self-work and then leading your staff and others in that same work as well. As leaders, you're responsible. So throughout the remainder of this webinar, you're going to hear from two of my excellent colleagues about their experiences as leaders, and you'll learn about strategies that you can employ to make meaningful changes during this racial pandemic and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Leandra. What I want to talk about really is sort of our sort of having some personal agency and being. I really believe that leadership is in all levels. That we are leaders in our own right, and so I'm hoping part of what I want to talk, what I will share is our own sort of ability to be able to make some changes in whatever capacity or whatever level that we are in an organization. Next slide. Next slide, please. So how I want to sort of introduce this framework called cultural humility, if you're not familiar with. And there are just sort of many things that we can sort of use. And for me, this framework has really helped me kind of guide how I kind of move forward with really having of how I see change happens in my work, both personally and professionally. So if you are not aware, cultural humility was a concept developed by two pediatricians, African-American pediatricians, Dr. Melanie Tervalon and Dr. Jan Murray Garcia, who actually started the work in the 1990s. And if you remember, there was really a sort of an event that happened in the 1990s that really began again the conversation of race relations in the 90s with pretty much the Rodney King riot, the Rodney King event that happened in the 90s. And then also sort of sparked the LA riots that happened. And both these two pediatricians really were confronted with, like, how do we really look at really engaging communities and really providing care that really is culturally relevant or responsive to what they needed at that time. And Dr. Tervalon, who was a physician at Children's Hospital, were feeling many of what was sort of happening in the community miles and miles away from LA, where all these things that were happening in Oakland. And she was really trying to think about, well, what can we do to really engage Children's Hospital and the community, because it was really affecting client care. And so they came up with these two concepts that they published in 1998. So the two tenets or the principles of cultural humility starts with really, we all should be engaged in a lifelong process of critical self-reflection and self-critique, right? That this is a marathon, not a sprint, that all of us engages in self-reflection every day, every minute of what our buttons, what our biases, how we see the world, what's the lens that we see the world, and what we bring into conversations, how we show up, and what are and how we affect circumstances, right? And what are opportunities where we can grow, and what are the things that we need to learn more about, and when we show up and how we step back. And that every opportunity is really an opportunity for us to kind of pause and really reflect. And for me as a clinical psychologist, I think about that, that 50-minute, quote unquote, 50-minute hour, that actually that 50-minute, when we see a client, that 10-minute is really not to document, right? Not to do the documentation, but to pause for that last 10 minutes when the client leaves and say, what sort of happened in that session? How am I mindful about what happened there? What are some insights that I can think about that really will help benefit sort of our working together, that when they come back, I can be sort of more helpful in insights, not just sort of, whether you call it as the reflection, because it's going to benefit both sort of our interactions. So that really is what that mindfulness. And so when providing supervision with your staff, when you're providing when you're meeting with your colleagues, a moment to reflect and really saying, well, how did I show up? What was that? What was there an opportunity there? Is a moment to really think about growth. The next part in that principle of cultural humility is really readdressing power imbalance. And again, when they talked about this, it's more of a patient-provider relationship, but really it's about that actually there's an power imbalance in every relationship, right? That there is a power difference in every relationship. And ignoring that really ignores privilege, that people, that we have privileges in different circumstances. And so when I come into a room, I think about what is sort of the power imbalance there, and what do I do to either acknowledge that. And I know that oftentimes we can't necessarily create a balance there, but what can I do to acknowledge that power imbalance and create spaces where we try to acknowledge that, so that we can have sort of a much more open dialogue and create sort of opportunities that is lifted up, so we can work together in a way that's sort of open. So how do we do that? And who do we engage in those conversations so that the decision making is open and equitable, for example, right? And who needs to be on the table so that we are informed in our decision making. The next principle is really developing mutual and beneficial partnerships with the communities really that we are working with. And especially with local government, for example, we really need to figure out that the reason why we're here is for the benefit for the people in service of people. And oftentimes, because especially when we are sort of in crisis, that we make decisions because, or we make decisions sort of on behalf of other people. And really, at the end of the day, that we should do our best to engage as many people, especially communities that are most impacted by the decisions that we make or are going to make, and make them part of that decision-making process. And so when we are, for example, working with clients, to ensure that to our best of our ability, that they are part of our clinical care, that they are fully informed, that they are benefiting as much as possible, right, with the kinds of interventions that we're using, and really a client-centered approach in what we're doing. And then the one that I'm really focused on as a leader, as I've moved up in systems, is that we advocate and we maintain institutional accountability for this work. We cannot do racial justice work by ourselves. No one person can do this work alone. It is important, and it behooves of institutions to create the infrastructures to sustain this work. When I was mostly a practicing clinician, as somebody who's really, I would say, passionate about social justice, I was the one always front and center, going to classes and trainings that really helped me become a more culturally responsive provider. I would do it, on my own time, in addition to, because I needed my license, I would do it extra, just because I was really passionate about it. But I realized over time, it should not just be a burden or a responsibility that I held on my own, that I should have been supported and could be supported by the organization, because at the end of the day, the work, if I continued to provide those really culturally responsive, culturally humble services, it didn't just benefit the client, it also benefited the whole system. So it is the responsibility of the institutions to create practices, opportunities, policies, workflows that support staff of color, that support practices and policies, that support these practices, equitable practices for organizations to thrive and staff to thrive, to continue be able to work, and that our workforce to continue to thrive in our organizations. And if we didn't have that, and we didn't have policies and resources that support that, if our staff leave and if our leaders leave, then the work will not continue. And so for me, cultural humility, these concepts of cultural humility really help provide a framework that I can carry on as a leader that continues to grow every day, that is not perfect, that is flawed, that benefits from learning from other people. But if I keep this at heart, can have sort of benchmarks along the way that can help me in my North Star of really embracing love and justice in my work. Next slide. So I want to sort of center, as we're switching, I want to take a moment. So I want to sort of focus on a little bit and really start with my with what I really believe in, that leadership, in my opinion, starts with self first. You cannot be a really good leader without doing the work with yourself first. And that is sort of my core belief, is that the work really needs to be done with yourself first to be really a great leader. And for me, that means really embracing and believing and doing a lot of work with engaging and embracing the principle number one in cultural humility, which is engaging in the lifelong process of critical self-reflection and critique. And oftentimes that is the hardest, because we want to appear good. We want to say we're the best. We want to be a person that shows up and be perfect. And yet we are imperfect. And I've come to believe that we are perfect with our imperfectness. And to embrace that is really something that I try to do every day. And that when we are engaging in a lifelong process of self-reflection, we have to know what our bias is, what our prejudices are, what are our strengths and our weakness, And in my growth as a leader, I have come to realize that what my strengths are is, and I'm trying to grow still, is my ability to really invest in relationships, that I might not necessarily be the best person with technical expertise in all areas, but I invest in relationships. And for me, that's the foundation of why I became a therapist, is because I believe that change happens because we create really good relationships, that clients come to us and are ready. We're privileged enough to learn their deepest secrets because they trust us, and there's hope there that we can foster, that when we give them options, when we share the stories and we give them options, they're willing, because we either symbolically hold their hands through the process. They say, I'm willing to try that something differently. I'm willing to open my heart to do something different and take a risk. And that for me is about change also. So when we trust and build trust with other people, they are willing to open their heart to say, oh, I've never tried something like that. I've never thought of it that way. Maybe I will look at it more or think about it more, and I'll take that risk because, you know, we've talked about it quite a little bit differently, and let's try it out. And I know that, you know, you're not going to be punitive with me, and I'm willing to try that. So that for me is really, I think, important in sort of building relationships with people. And then also part of it is that it's really about growth, right? We know that we can be racist, we know that we can be biased, and that's just the reality. I think part of the conversation that's hard with people when we say that we're racist is people think that it's that you're always going to be racist. And really, when we talk about it, that yes, we can be racist, but we can also not be, or anti-racist. But the goal is to really build that up and elevate it so you can, as my colleague Leandra said, that you, by bringing up the conversation of your implicit bias, where are the opportunities that you can be more aware of that, so you can pause and be mindful and say, wait, before I make a decision, let me think about where does my lens and prejudice can be affecting my decision making, right? So that's why that process of critical self-reflection is important. And I think as a leader, it's really important, like, why am I being provoked about this? Why am I having strange reactions or really strong reactions about this? The ability, I think, for us to be able to say, God, that really is not sitting well with me. I'm like, I really am very angry about this, or I am really upset. And pausing and being mindful really creates an opportunity for growth. And I feel like that's really a milestone of really a great leader, and saying, like, you know, I really was just off at that point, and I need to think about that a little bit more and change my behavior or my reaction. The other thing that I want to talk about, and why I think critical self-reflection and critique is so important, is this study that came out that I was really just, I would say, so surprised, probably maybe not surprised, maybe just profoundly affected, was an article that came out from The Atlantic in 2017 by Jerry Unseem, I think is his last name. And the title was Power Causes Brain Damage. In his article, he actually had some respondents undergo sort of a study where they went through a transcranial magnetic stimulation. So respondents who were given, quote unquote, power went through this, you know, this transcranial magnetic study, and by sharing, by giving those folks some power, they noticed that in those pictures of the brain function, the function of the brain shifted, right? The mere fact that they were given power, the brain functioning shifted a little bit. They saw that the ability for the brain to mirror, meaning when somebody is, you know, when somebody in front of you is, you know, sharing a sad story, the neurons in your brain, there's a specific neurons in your brain that shifts, that shows your face to be sad, right? So maybe your face starts to frown, not frown, but maybe frowning a little bit. You're when somebody's you know, sharing a happy story, you smile a little bit. So that's the ability to mirror. They noticed that the folks that were given power shows less likely the ability to mirror the person's facial expression. So again, right, people who were given power, their brains showed less mirroring ability. So that tells you involuntarily that the mere fact that these individuals, the respondents who were in that study, the mere fact that they had power showed that their brain functioning shifted, that they did not have the mirroring capability, as much mirroring capabilities. This said that they actually showed less empathy. It was really a striking sort of realization that we have to work hard when we move up and become leaders to be more empathic to people, right? That that we have to really work hard at showing more empathy with people because our neurons shift, right? And it's not just about, and the one thing that I thought about when I read that study, well, what kind of power, are we talking about? Is it positional power? Is it money? Is it economics? Is it titles? And it's really shifted. But for me, the story was, whatever we define as power, it really talks more about our ability as leaders to be more empathic to folks. And that's why we as leaders, we need to really work hard of really becoming more, trying hard to be more self-reflective and say, well, given that, I'm the quote unquote boss or I'm a supervisor, how can I work harder of really being more concerned or empathic to other folks? Which leads me to a conversation about being vulnerable, right? When I was growing up, I always saw that my role models of leaders are the ones that showed up super confident, knowing all the answers. Oftentimes, I would say authoritarian, altogether, right? Strong. And that was sort of my role model of what leadership was all about, always sort of to some degree stoic, I would say. And I realized over time now as I turned 50 this year, and really that really is a false image of what leadership is. And I have now come to realize that really leadership especially is really about being vulnerable. And here's actually a quote that I recently saw from sort of Harvard, although it's been, I would say, almost 6 years old. That vulnerability here does not mean being weak or submissive. To the contrary, especially during crisis, it implies the courage to be yourself. It means replacing professional distance and cool with oftentimes being uncertain and taking risks and emotional exposure. And that opportunities for being vulnerable present themselves to us at work every day. And, I ground myself to that, especially during COVID, where I'm supposed to know everything, that I'm supposed to be certain that what I'm going to make a decision about will stick for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, knowing that it won't because things are changing. And that sometimes saying that I don't have it together today is okay because it gives permissions to staff to say, I don't have it together either today. That perfectness is not really what I'm asking for, but humanness. Because in times of crisis, I'm not asking for perfectness, I'm asking for compassion and gratitude and showing up as your true selves. Because I don't want to be any kind of leader, but a leader that shows up because of love for humanity and compassion and gratitude. That I want to be a leader that's really showing up because I care about people, and that I'm not interested in heroes, but collective heroes that come together when times of crisis and come together. And that courage for me is to be able to say, I don't know, but for me to know better is that I need others to stand with me together to make decisions that will benefit more people and not just me. So leadership for me starts with self, by being able to say, I am a flawed person. I am perfect in my imperfectness, that I am biased to some degree, that I bring in the lens that I see the world, and that makes me perfect, and that I need others to be a great leader. And I think that really is totally against from the leadership that I've grown up, that I have to show up as perfect and infallible and flawless, because I'm not that kind of leader. And especially during crisis, that's the kind of leader that we need. And will everybody believe in that? Will everybody support it? No. But I think it's really showing up in your true authentic selves is really what's important right now. Next slide. So I want to sort of end, and the reason why I'm saying this is because I think it's really important, sort of a grounding word, and why it's important for me to share that is because I've really grown up in the ideology of what leadership is all about. That I've really grown up in the ideology of the white ideology of leadership: stoic, perfect, strong, confident, objective, right? And we know that there are many kinds of leaders. And as a person of color that's trying to be a great leader, a good leader, an authentic leader, I am trying to now dismantle that fact that there's one kind of leader. Because there are many kinds of leader, and all of us can be great leaders in our own right. And that, I think, is something that we need to embrace, right? And the intersectionality of who we are components and ingredients of great leaders. And we have come to just believe, because we have been racially socialized to believe that there's one kind of leader. You know, as a transgender person, as an Asian person, as an immigrant, as somebody who did not grow up here, as somebody who's still growing up to be a leader in their own right, that's imperfect and flawless, and that's not flawless, like that's still trying to be who they are. I want to embrace that. And I want you all to also see that you can be a great leader in your own right. So this professionalism that we're talking about is really important because it is in the concept of a white supremacist ideology of what leadership is all about. So I really want to just ground ourselves there, because we really need to embrace that we are now trying to dismantle of what leadership is all about, is different from what we've all grown up to be, or what we've been socialized to be. So I want to now sort of end in the last few minutes to say, my belief is, as we are grounding ourselves up and showing ourselves to be great leaders, especially in this time, is the belief that is to understand that everyone is affected by unjust systems, right? So as a leader, trying to be a good leader, a great leader, is to anchor myself, is that unjust systems affect all of us. So when I'm trying to make decisions, hopefully that will benefit, it's not just going to benefit one group of people, but all people. The next praxis is that we ground ourselves from our roots and our identities, and that we embrace that, and that we use our identities and our roots and advance those roots and identities and use those to advance justice. That our lens and our experiences, use those to advance causes that move justice forward. The other one, if we are fortunate enough to be able to be in leadership positions, and that we play the game while we change the game, right? A mentor of mine said, and there was a time in my professional career, I would say not long ago, when I said, you know, it's really hard to be in these positions because I feel like I'm just, you know, biting my tail. And she said to me, more reason, because of so much bureaucracy and so much red tape and so much frustration that I face pretty much every day. And she said, more reason for you to stay in those hard places, because we need people like you to be on those tables so you can change the game. Because if you burn out and you leave those tables, it will be the same kinds of people that will run the show. So while we are playing the game, while we are in those spaces, we have to be strategic to change the rules of the game to benefit others. And that's why we come again back to what the roots and our identities, and use that to move forward to those causes that will change the game. But we cannot continue being in the game if we do not take care of ourselves and engage in self-healing practices. And that's sort of my last comment. It is a must. It is a must that for us to be able to continue doing this work, that we engage in self-care and self-healing practices. Maybe not self-healing, whatever healing practices that you must. I have been fortunate in my career that I have wonderful mentors and friends and spiritual beliefs that have sustained me. So I am asking, and maybe a plea, is that you find people, nature, books that will sustain you, because we need all of you to be part of this movement. Because if you burn out, and if you choose to walk away because it is hard and it's frustrating, no one else will be able to sustain this work. And so I want to leave you with that if there is anything that you need to take care of yourself as leaders, to find that, because we are in it for the fight of our lives, especially at this moment. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Leandra and Jay, and that was very to the point, and also, you know, it speaks to what we need to do as leaders and how we show up. You know, there's a saying that culture eats leadership for lunch. And when we think about how we show up, I want to just pause for a moment and just give a scenario, particularly as we think about, you know, what's happening right now in our society and the protest. And because as leaders, our staff are always looking at how we show up. And so, so let's think about two scenarios, two fictitious characters. One is Mark and one is Beth. Mark had posted on his Facebook page several pictures of him marching in the protest holding Black Lives Matters poster. Well, this was very concerning to his Black and brown colleagues. They said, wait a minute. Is this Mark, the manager who had 5 folks of color in his department, 3 Black, 2 Latinx? And when he took over his department, there's nobody else of color now in his department? Is this the same Mark that hasn't hired anyone of color? And wow, he's out there marching. And now let's think about Beth. You know, Beth was so proud of her participation in the protest, and she sent emails to her colleagues, and she organized a place to meet on that Saturday to, you know, to march and stand up for, you know, what happened to, you know, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and all the social unrest and against police brutality. And 4 members on her team, 4 Black members, said, wait a minute, is this the same Beth that Monday through Friday is making life hell for our Black staff, who's consistently challenging decisions around how we give services to the Black community? Is this that same Beth? And now she's out there marching? So I want to begin by giving this framework of how we don't want to be the Mark and Beth, but consistently think about how we're showing up. Because what we know is trust is absolutely critical. Next slide. So when we think about trust, and when we think about how do we show up and how do we engage communities of color, we have to first acknowledge that the system is broken. And sometimes that's difficult for, you know, people to acknowledge. The system and the conversations and the dialogues that I'm having now with leaders across, you know, the different counties that we operate, it's somewhat ironic because it's the same conversation I've had for 27 years. But today, they're now acknowledging, yes, the system is broken. But when I've said this in the past, well, Andre, you shouldn't say that. Well, the data hasn't changed. The outcomes hasn't changed. So what's different? Well, I think people are now coming to a sense of reality that yes, the system is broken. And as a leader, we have to be the first ones to acknowledge that. We can't show up one day and make life hard for our Black and brown staff, and then show up the next day saying, I'm right there with you with my Black Lives Matter on, Black Lives Matter shirt on. So when you think about trust and you think about, how our staff engage communities of color, particularly in all of the social and economic inequalities and the race relationships that's going on right now in our society, it hasn't changed for Black and brown communities. The difference is we are now, the benefit of now seeing it through our own lens that says, oh my gosh, we now believe what we're now seeing through all the Facebook posts and all the social media, where we're now saying, yes, oh my gosh, this is happening. But it's no different from what our communities have said for generations. And so how do we now create trust in an environment where we didn't have trust? And as I said earlier, culture eats leadership for lunch every single day. So how do we show up different in spite of the social and economic inequalities so that we can ensure that the staff that we send out to engage our community is effective? But if our staff don't have the tools and the resources and they don't feel that it's a safe place to have a dialogue with their manager about race relations and about things that they see are wrong, then therefore they're not going to be effective with our clients. And part of that effectiveness with our client, it doesn't really matter how many initials you have after your name. Doesn't matter that you were the best clinician on the team or you got promoted, because oftentimes it's unfortunate how our systems are structured. We take great individual contributors and we put them into leadership roles and assume they're going to be a good leader. Well, that doesn't equate always. If we were on the private side and you were being promoted, you would then be developed. If you worked at HP, they would invest in sending you to leadership development and you would go get your master's in management, or you would understand that management is an expertise no different from being a clinician. But unfortunately, in our industry, that doesn't happen. So we have a lot of managers that haven't been trained and therefore are not qualified to lead. And sometimes how that shows up, it shows up as though from the clinical lens, it's all about you and it's not about me. And I always say this, people don't leave companies, they don't leave systems, they leave managers. And so when we think about, again, how do we now create an environment that is about trust so that our staff are effective in how they engage? And one of the tools that I talk a lot about, and I do a training, how do you engage communities of color? It's an all-day training, but trust is the outcome of effective engagement, and effective engagement is your tool to building a trusting environment, because that's absolutely critical. I give you one scenario. This was in the early 2000s. I saw that the disproportionate impact of African Americans in child welfare, which is happening all across the nation. We're always 3 and 6 times overrepresented within the system. And I know a lot of departments everybody's been trying to resolve this, but the reality is if you close the front door, then guess what? Because disparity and disproportionality of how African Americans are treated throughout the system doesn't change. It happens at every decision point. You find biases in those decisions. So we started a Children of Color task force in Santa Clara County, and I started that back in 2003 with some other community folks and said, listen, we got to do something different here. If we don't do anything different, then nothing's going to change. And so it was a community initiative. And then over the next couple of years, the director of SSA said, listen, let's bring this and embed this inside the county system so that we can have full participation at the table and create a framework where we're looking at decision-making points. So, but what I will say is, so over the years, it's really about consistency, being at the table, addressing these fundamental, what I call fundamental values of how we think about our clients. And if our staff don't feel that way, then they can't therefore deliver it to the clients. And what I used to always be perplexed is that in those environments, we would hear about staff that says, oh my gosh, I don't want to go to the fourth floor. There was this sense of, the boogeyman was on the fourth floor and what was going to happen up there. And so that was about leadership, right? And how do we create an environment where people feel empowered? So when I think about trust, let me pause for 1 second. I want us to think about the framework of our work. We engage with a client and we begin to, expectations of them is that they discuss with us all of their vulnerabilities, because trust is really the firm belief in your reliability, that you have their best interests at hand, that there's shared intent. So when you think about your first date, let's just for a moment think about, that first date you had with your spouse or or your loved one, or a date that you went out on. In that first date, did you talk about all of the bad things about your last relationship? About, my last relationship, my gosh, yeah, this, I had to call the police, or, he had 10 kids and I just couldn't take it. I mean, you don't do that, right? You oftentimes have your representative that's out there in front of you communicating. So think about that first meeting that we have in our normal human way of engaging with people, but we expect our staff to do it in a very different way when it comes to our clients. We expect them to share their vulnerabilities. And when you think about, trust, you have to think about, it is about the assumption that this person that I'm sharing these things with has my best intentions at hand. It is both logical and it's both emotional. I mean, it's where you expose your vulnerabilities to people, believing that they're not going to take advantage of your openness. And that's where our system fails. You hear the stories all the time from clients and families that felt that they were taken advantage of, that they read a report in court that wasn't what they said. And so when you think about how do we now show up and create an environment where folks are building trust, and that we're not pencil whipping our families. If we don't understand how to teach our staff to do that through how we show up with them, then we're perpetuating the cycle of racism and how we engage our communities, which therefore, we're falling down. And as we see right now, what's happening around the United States, and the attack on African American community, it is further perpetuating the inability to build trusting relationships. So how do you manage your staff? How do you create an environment in the current context where they're thinking about, the challenges of how do I engage a community right now that has a black cloud on them? And we've seen that now, and we've seen the perpetuation of that. It is getting worse. So in your environment, if you're not intentionally creating a much more open environment where we're having courageous conversations about what's happening in our environment, therefore you're going to continue to perpetuate the traumas that we're perpetuating on our families. When the George Floyd situation happened and you saw the police, what I call the over-policing of our communities. I was in several meetings with some folks from tech communities as well as some county leaders, and one of the first things I said was, the worst thing that we could do in this moment is to get on a Zoom call with our staff and begin business as normal, because we don't know what that staff is going through. We don't know if that staff yesterday lost their brother, or if that staff yesterday their dad's in the hospital because of COVID-19, or if that staff yesterday's mom just got deported. So from a perspective of a person of color, oftentimes our white leaders completely fall down when it comes to understanding that perspective about the creating that environment where we are acknowledging and recognizing and understanding. And we might not understand, but we can have a sense of creating space so that people can say, yes, this is what's on my heart today. I can't go out and meet my expectations. I can't go out and meet those billable units, with this heaviness on my heart, because what you're seeing is a black cloud that's laying over our community. So trust is absolutely the cornerstone to how do you build a effective work environment, but also an effective team that is successfully engaging our communities. So therefore, they have a sense of appreciation and value. and a little bit earlier, I talked a little bit about the backpacks and the backpacks of trauma. And as we think about when we're dealing with our communities, and oftentimes we deal with them very singular. And as leaders, we're focused on, those things that we're responsible for. If we're coming from behavioral health, we're focusing on their, Medi-Cal, we're focusing on their medical necessities. We're coming from social services, we're focusing on their, the elements of their child welfare plan, whatever the court says, it's probation, and when you think about a family that's in the center of all that, it's oftentimes very difficult to navigate, and therefore they become overprogrammed. We fall through the cracks. It's almost, think about if you're going to the dealership to pick up your car and you dropped off in the morning and there's a noise, there's a knocking in your rear, you need a tune-up, you need an oil change, you think you have a tire that's getting bald, and then you show back up to pick up that car, and that person says, well, listen, if you want to know about your knocking, go talk to that person over there. If you want to know about your tires, go talk to that person over there. You would be, in a place where it's like, oh my gosh, I don't feel safe. And that's what happens with our communities. It's a lack of feeling safe. Next slide, please. So let's talk about how do we think about our environments, and part of this, there are elements to what I call how do we effectively engage, and we've been using this formalized term of being trauma informed, and there's a lot of research about what does trauma informed look like, where our systems are recognizing the traumatic experiences. There's the ACEs. There's a lot of things where, as a provider of services, we are always saying our services acknowledging and recognizing all of those traumatic experiences that happen in this family's life, and are we creating services that understand that? And oftentimes we fall down in thinking about how does that land in our communities. So when we think about being trauma informed, we just think about the formalized structures that we work within. I used to push back a lot on our county partners when we used to, have these emergency treatment team meetings, and they would be between 8 and 5, Monday through Friday. And I used to say all the time, so let me get this straight. So this is about us ensuring that we can find the most appropriate place for this young person to go that is connected to family first, but we want to have a meeting to make that decision at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday. And we expect the family to show up. And then we're doing it at our offices. So I used to always say, well, what do you think is going to happen from that? And what oftentimes happen is that professionals would outnumber the person's family. And then what do? We then say, oh my gosh, the family's not engaging. We then, follow our protocol of being deficit focused on what the family's not doing versus the gifts and the strengths of the family. So guess what? When we think about how and when best to engage the family, it's not when it's convenient for us. We're the professionals. The goal is that we work ourselves out of a job. It's not convenient for us. So as leaders, are we creating structures and frameworks, again, that allow our staff to be successful in understanding what tools to pull out of the toolbox so that they can be effective in engaging? And Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, is very ineffective for our community. And it's been proven time and time again. And so when we think about when is the best time to engage families, well, it's, if we don't want to ensure families show up, then it's between 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. But if we want to absolutely engage that family, then guess what? Do it on a Saturday, do it on a Sunday. Make sure we're doing it when it's more convenient for the family. So as leaders, how are we ensuring that we're looking at barriers to access, looking at barriers to engagement, and being informed from a trauma perspective to have that family drive? And I used to always say, there was our offices are oftentimes great places. We love to have these beautiful buildings that we work in, but those buildings are terrible for families to drive to. Imagine the traumatic experience that happens when they're driving to the building, and they walk in the door and there's these glass windows and you see other kids sitting there with their families and they're doing a visitation in the front lobby. That used to always kill me, because I used to say, guys, this is the worst thing to do, is to have, this re-traumatizes families every single time when we do things from a perspective of us, what's convenient for us, what structures do we have in place? Those structures are failing. Those structures have failed. The question now is, what are you going to do different? How do we show up differently so our environments are reflective of our young folks in our communities and not reflective of the convenience of our schedule and the structures that we work within? So when we think about setting an environment and how do you build trust, it is really about making sure that we show up where the family is. We show up when and where and how the family needs us to show up. And we don't come in there with, oftentimes, I say, well, we weaponize. And this is, and part of this is, and many of us, on this trainings, everyone probably can think back right now. It might have happened yesterday, it might have happened last year. You can think back right now where you're sitting there saying, you walk away from a meeting with the young folks, with a youth and a family, and you walk away saying, why is this kid in care? Why is this kid here? Why are we involved in this kid's family? Well, the reality of it is that's the moment to step up and say something and do something different, particularly as leaders. And oftentimes, when we think about customer service and how we show up as understanding who our customers are, we don't recognize that these are our customers. I used to do this, in one of my trainings, I talk about, let's just take your pay for the day. Let's say you get paid $100 a day. And this is how we're going to now compensate you. In order for you to get your $100, you have 10 clients that you need to go see. You're going to get paid after each one of those 10 clients. Every client has $10 in their pocket, and they're going to pay you after your individual visit. How are we going to show? Do you think we would show up differently? I think we would. So we don't value our communities oftentimes because we don't see them pulling money out of their pocket that's going to pay us right there in the moment. Think about the restaurant you went to, the last restaurant you went to before everything happened. And how we, the waiter or the waitress that comes up to you and, they're working hard because you're the paying customer. Extrapolate that should be no different in how we think about our communities of color, and how you train our staff and the staff to think about it from that context, not from the lens of we're looking for everything that's negative about that family and therefore, focusing on their deficits. So being trauma informed. One of the things one of the great songs, and I would ask everyone to go listen to this song. It's a song called "Man in the Mirror." "Man in the Mirror" by Michael Jackson. It's a song that came out, many years ago, but it's a great song. Listen to those words because it talks about you as the individual. What are you going to do different? How do you value the world? How do you value the people in front of you that you are responsible for leading? How do you show up? And part of this is, as leaders, we have to invest in our development. The system is not going to invest in your development. So you have to take a personal commitment to say, how do I invest? You have to think about management as no different going to school, getting your MSW and studying for your licensure. It's no different when it comes to management. And unfortunately, leaders take their work as a great clinician into their role as a manager, and it conflicts with how you show up, because management is about looking inward, about what can you do different. People don't leave companies, they leave individuals, they leave managers. So what are you going to do different, and how are you going to show up and create a culture where people are effectively trusting you and they effectively believe in the direction that you're going? One of my great books is a book called Principle, The Power of Principle. And it talks about honor and respect, and how do we show up in honoring the folks that are now dependent upon our leadership to give them the tools and the resources to be successful. How are we showing up? Are you vulnerable to your staff? Are you acknowledging and raising your hand and creating an environment where you're celebrating those mistakes and turning them into wins? I know sometimes that's very tough in formal systems, because I know that from my 27 years, I've seen it time and time again. When there is something that we've done wrong as a system to a family or to an organization, we go deep in trying to justify what we're doing. First is saying the most two powerful words that we don't use enough in this system: I'm sorry. I'm sorry. If we say that more often, then we therefore are creating an environment where people feel that they can come to you and share and be vulnerable with you and share and recognize their mistakes. Because if you go to work every single day and you don't make a mistake, that means you're not working. We're not working on the Tesla assembly line where we're pulling down levers and dealing with making making doors. We are dealing with people, and everybody is individually and everybody is different. Next slide, please. So one of the things that particularly during this time with the uprising and the protests and the horrific things that we're seeing, I think what was most horrific about the George Floyd situation, and I want to give you guys context of this. So if you think about, oftentimes when we see police brutality or a situation, it's oftentimes through the video of that police officer. So you oftentimes only see the victim. You don't oftentimes see the police officer themselves. What was very different about George Floyd is that in one frame, you could see the murderer and you could see the victim. And you saw the callousness on his face. That was the moment, I think, for many of us that shook us at our core. For the Black community, it's no different. It's not something that was new to us. For the white community, you finally saw at the core just the sense of hatred for that Black man. And we cannot forget that image as we do our work. So when we think about how do we create anti-racism cultures within our organization, there are many examples you see on the slides. The first thing is we have to recognize that we were not educated through our educational system about our true history. So we as leaders have to take this moment to get re-educated. Black, brown, white, you have to get re-educated to the true history. We all talk about George. I learned George Washington had wood teeth. And when I grew, that's what George Washington had, wood teeth. George Washington had teeth of slaves in his mouth. So it's our opportunity, it's our expectation as leaders that we understand the true history. Therefore, we are better informed and engaged in how we engage with our staff of color, and therefore how we engage with our communities. So there's some books here that I think are absolutely great opportunities to get engaged. I wrote a book about my journey, 27 years starting Unity Care, coming from tech, and my journey working within the formalized system that's broken, which people don't like me to say, but it is. We have to acknowledge it where it is. And so the other thing is about how do we now show up different? If you go to work tomorrow and you think that, oh my gosh, we're just going to all kumbaya and say this is great, it's not going to happen. Your policies, your practices are the same. This is an opportunity as leaders to co-create a value statement. I'm doing this now with some companies, is that, what do we value? We haven't paid attention to this long enough, and now it's time for us to stand up and pay attention. So what do we value? The other thing is as an agency, as a leader, have you taken the pledge to create a anti-racism against bigotry, hatred within your organization? Your staff are looking at you as the leader. It's great that everybody responded in that moment and gave out a statement to their staff. The question is now, how are you going to show up different? You take that moment and you move it to a movement. The other thing is, I always say, well, you should do a climate survey, and race and how does race factor into your work? It should be a part of your everyday conversation. I think at Unity Care, race isn't something that we go hire someone to come talk about. This is embedded in everything that we do. We talk about it every day. And if you're not talking about it, then you're not creating that environment within your organization because your staff are talking about it. We all are talking about it individually. Many of you are talking about it at home. So guess what? We know this work is so close to our values as people. Therefore, we have to have those same conversations within the work environment. So creating, and as a leader, one of the things you have to do is you have to give permission. Particularly as a white leader, you have to give permission and understand your white privilege. You give permission to your staff to say, listen, if I say something that is offensive to you, I need you to call me on it. And that's a lot for a leader to do that. But when you do that, then you're focusing on your learning. I always say as leaders, no different from when you're in college. You go to your classroom and you're learning. It's no different as a leader. Every day you're learning. So you want to create a learning organization, give permission to your staff that talks about, if I say anything that is offensive and I say it, incorrectly, please tell me. Because for Black folks and brown people, we know how to do what's called code switching. We've learned that in elementary school. We know how to show up into a white environment where it is the white privilege that is present, and we know how to adapt to that. it's very difficult for white folks to show up in a community of color and understand how to show up differently, because that's not something you've experienced. You haven't had those lived experiences in general, because whiteness is the prevalent community structures that we work within. So this is a great opportunity to begin to think about how that shows up. The other thing is your leadership. You know, and this is, and I get calls from a lot of friends that says, man, I can't find black folks. And I always say that's an excuse. So there are a lot of ways to say, let me be intentional on how I'm going to ensure I have black leaders in the organization. And the ones that I have, how am I investing in them to ensure that we are pouring just into them the same levels of access and resources we're pouring into our white colleagues? Because what you hear from black staff and brown staff is that, well, there's favoritism. Well, that person is on a track to, they're investing in that person to move up the ladder. But I've been here 10 years. Nobody's investing in me. You hear that all the time in our environments. You know, truth and reconciliation is so critical. You know, part of this whole journey that we're on as a society is that we are focused very critically on having voice. And you see from the White House on down that it's really about taking away our voice. It's really about, you know, going back to Jim Crow. I mean, the crazy stuff we hear coming out around, you know, getting rid of diversity training. I just heard that the other day. You know, just the perpetuation of the lack of recognition of structural racism that exists. 401 years since the transatlantic slave trade, and we have structural racism in every system. And when we hear dialogue that it doesn't exist, think about how staff show up to work the next day. So we have to be, as leaders, we have to be able to understand what I call the backpacks of trauma, that extra weight that's on our backs when we show up into an environment where we have to leave our culture in the car. That's oftentimes how we show up. You know, I hear this very often that, hey, when I come to work, I got to leave my culture in the car. So how do we create healing and reconciliation and create a dialogue for courageous conversations? So there's a couple examples about community boards. You know, and again, you know, oftentimes for staff, and when they're only black staff, and there's a conversation about race, everyone turns and looks at the black staff. Imagine the pressure of that black staff. I used to always say, you know, oftentimes that, you know, when you have a black person in a role that's in a leadership role, they have that extra pressure. Because if they do anything, oftentimes, where they're going to, you know, fund or hire an African American, people say, oh, they're doing it just because they're black. You know, that's, you know, again, that's that white privilege that comes forward. So we have to be at the place now where we're checking our white privilege, which means we have to get educated on how that shows up. The other thing is, you know, the training. Today is a series of training. I know this group has been through a variety of series of trainings. You know, trainings are great because, you know, it's a great way for people to have an opportunity to reset on their framework. But that's just one step, because we know when folks go off to training and they come back into the environment, a week later, they're oftentimes right back to their normal habits. So the reality is, what are you going to do to create a space for your staff to be engaged in these trainings and then come back and educate the rest of your departments? And then you as a leader are focusing on bringing in community resources to ensure that you're going deep around your policies and your practices. You know, in every community that we've been in and I've worked in, I've always pushed against our county systems. And, you know, I push hard and sometimes folks don't like it. But again, I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to focus on what's best for my community and the communities that we serve. And the reality of it is, you know, sometimes that lands wrong or that lands different. And so how do we create, you know, opportunities for the folks that you guys see in the communities as, oh my gosh, that's the instigators? You bring them into the inner circle. You get those folks engaged in the conversation before you start talking about we're going to roll out this new initiative for this community, because that's our normal practice. And you do it with folks that don't look like you at the table, and then you wonder why, you know, it's not landing well. You know, we wonder why, you know, the assassination of Michael Brown, that there was problems between the community and the police officers when there was 2 black police officers in the community that was 90% black. You know, those are obvious things. So when we think about, again, about our policies and our practices, go back and scrap your policies. Focus on policies that are going to focus on inclusion, anti-racism policies around our practices, because we know practices follow policies. And, you know, I can give you lots of situations where I've worked within our system partners and they've had policies that are disproportionately impactful to communities of color. and those policies are still in the books. And so you wonder why do we have such a disproportionate impact? Well, you got to look at the policy that drives practice and the folks that are making those decisions. And if their mindset is that, well, listen, this community is screwed up, so therefore I need to go in there and do what we need to do, right away we're focusing on the deficits versus the strengths and the gifts. So there's a great opportunity for us to reimagine how we show up every single day. And one of the things that I'm mindful of the time, but what I want to do is I want to read a letter that I wrote right after the George Floyd situation, because it really, I think I cried for almost 2 weeks just from the pain and trauma. And it's important as white leaders that we don't put this behind us. And that was something that happened, and no longer reminded of the trauma that our community is going through. So I'm going to read this letter. Dear George Floyd, I wrote this to Dear George Floyd. Dear George Floyd, words cannot express the deep pain in my bones as my heart aches with sorrow for what happened to you at the hands of those who took an oath to protect and serve. I can only pray that your soul is at rest as you sit at the feet of Jesus, watching the world come to your defense, saying enough is enough. Perhaps you're sitting with Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Walter Scott, Philando Castile, Drayshawn Sean Reed, Breonna Taylor, Botham Jean, Ahmaud Arbery, and even Emmett Till. Just a few of the millions of Black brothers and sisters who were unjustly murdered because of pure hatred and the legacy of discrimination. I can only imagine the conversation when you arrived. George, we pray the images of your horrifying death and your last words, I can't breathe, will finally penetrate the hearts and souls of Americans to take action against the hatred that fuels racism in our country. We've seen these episodes of violence play out for 401 years, and our question is, when will it end? In this moment, as an African-American man, nonprofit CEO of nearly 27 years, I have dedicated my life's mission to service of others to eradicate systemic racism that is pervasive in every aspect of our society: housing, education, employment, healthcare, law enforcement, environment, well-being. I call these the backpacks of trauma. They feel like 100 pounds of constant pressure on our necks, crippling and stifling the life out of our communities. I know this journey all too well. Like many who have experienced a constant knee on our necks at the mercy of institutions that don't value communities of color. Just a few months ago, I wrote about a racist attack that happened to me and my wife last summer, and you can read about that on Unity Care's website. So take a moment, and tomorrow we must wake up different with a renewed spirit and commitment to eradicating racism perpetuated by people in charge of institutions that don't value Black and brown lives. And so on my website, we have an initiative. If you go to the next slide, on my website, we have an initiative focusing on, how we eradicate the racism and how we show up differently to ensure that we are finally taking a moment. This is our moment, because this can't be fixed by Black folks. This is a moment for our allies to stand up and be just as upset about what's going on that we are and what we've experienced and the trauma that we felt. Can you go to the next slide? So this is a little bit about our initiative, COVID-19 Blacks initiative that we started. Again, addressing the disparities. And I would encourage everyone that's in this training to get engaged. And thank you for opportunity of presenting.
I want to start by thanking ANDRÉ, you, Jay, Leandra. These were incredibly powerful presentations. I do want to let all of you know that there were so many acknowledgements and thank yous coming through in the question box. So just want to first start there. The second thing I want to note is that there were many requests for more resources. And so resources related to managers, leadership training, how to build trust. And so I just want to let everybody know that those will definitely go back to all of our presenters, and we will give them some time to really be able to identify some resources, and those will go up on our website when we do the question and answer. So let me start. We have about 10 minutes, and so I actually have a question for each of you. The first one, Jay, is for you. In reference to white supremacy and the bias of professionalism, how would you define or describe a transcultural perspective on professionalism? Or is professionalism itself a racist construct?
I'm not sort of a linguist, so I can't sort of define that. But I really, I think that's sort of the reality of that. When you think about a leader, and this is just sort of my own sort of personal journey to this, and when I have defined over my career of what the leader is, it always sort of just my definition has always been sort of identified by what we define as sort of this objective, professional. And when I really start looking at the definition of professionalism, it's sort of this white ideology. And a lot of the work that now that I'm paying attention to is Jones and Okun's work, which is dismantling white supremacy. And so they do a lot of that. So Jones and Okun are probably some of the materials that folks will use. But I also look back into my own, I would say, soul searching about what is leadership in my own ancestry, in pre-colonial Philippines, right? That when you look at how the Philippines were governed, quote unquote, governed prior to Spain coming and the Americans coming, and what was that like? That they really have sort of more of a collective decision making, and so it's really looking at that that they relied on the community collective versus sort of more that you had this very really steep hierarchy. And so I think that's the piece of really saying, like, I am the end all be all person that knows everything. And for me, that's sort of a very capitalistic perspective, like it's benefiting who. So I think that's the definition that I'm trying to understand. But maybe it is like, what do you, and I'm having to also think about when I question my own self about when I say when somebody's not professional, what do I mean, right? And my own definition of professionalism is really the standard of what I think I've been socially learned. So I think that's that. But I would probably go back to Okun and Jones's sort of definitions, and I'm sure there are other people, but it's just sort of my own self-reflection. And I want to also reflect that the work of like really what a little bit of the implicit bias there, right? What are my own assumptions? And usually that's sort of measured when my own expectation, because if that's the lens that I see the world.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Leandra, I have a question for you. There was a real kind of focus on supervisors and clinicians and therapists, how it is that you believe they can practice cultural humility. Do you have any kind of thoughts on this?
Well, I think the self-work has to happen first. So, I think when a lot of the research that's come out about diversity and then cultural competence, the terms keep changing. Now it's cultural responsiveness and cultural humility, and it goes on and on. And I think the self-work has to happen first before someone becomes an expert. And the reason that the terms are changing is because as there was more research into these areas, it was clear that there isn't a destination that we're getting to. It's an ever-evolving process. And so doing the self-work, educating yourself, and really being vulnerable, as one of my colleagues said earlier, that vulnerability that you show to your staff will allow them to be more comfortable coming to you and having the discussions as well. So really starting with yourself, which is the hardest part sometimes, despite the fact that we're leaders. I think sometimes with that term leadership, we think, well, we've made it, right? We did the work, we worked hard, and now we've arrived. But that continuous reflection, that continuous self-challenge is really what allows people to get to the place where they are able to lead others in that reflection and continue to grow. I would just say there's no destination. It's an evolving process, but being open and vulnerable is really the first step, and sometimes the toughest step.
I agree. Thank you so much. ANDRÉ, you had the most questions about resources. I think at least 10 that I cut and paste. So let me just ask you about one resource that you might have in mind, and if not, we will go ahead and put this, we'll get the information from you, we'll do some of the research, we'll post it to the website. But the climate survey, do you have any actual kind of climate survey references that you would want to kind of recommend?
So yes, I don't have the website in front of me, but yes, I think that oftentimes we do client surveys. It's about do you feel supported? Is the manager being responsive to you? But it's not about race. And so if folks are doing climate surveys now, there is some great literature online about client surveys that do focus on race, because there's that opportunity to ensure that we're asking the right questions. But does someone feel, how, is race talked about in our work environment? Do you feel that there's barriers because you are African American? Do you feel, there's all kind of questions that can be generated. So there are things online, but I've seen a couple of examples, and so I can send that to you. We can send that out to the group.
Excellent, that'll be great. And then one last, this is a question as compared to a resource question, Andre. How does the current behavioral health system and the overall lack of critical system reflection actually negatively impact our community police forces by unintentionally offering ineffective services that push persons of color back into the community with serious issues and little or no faith in healthcare solutions offered to them?
Well, there's a couple different things I heard in that question. So, we know that wherever there are mandates, there's an overrepresentation of communities of color. So child welfare, juvenile justice, and we know, child welfare got darker over the years, and the crack epidemics. We know all those things. And whenever there are no mandates, there's typically an underrepresentation of folks of color. And so we know there's a lot of communities of color that are not getting the needs that, undiagnosed, not getting the resources they need. And so, part of the challenges, and oftentimes, when communities of color, when we think about mental health, everyone thinks about that uncle that talks to himself, right? And so when folks think about mental health, naturally, it's taboo in communities of color. And so, you have to navigate those words and our ability to engage. And unfortunately, sometimes we bring our professionalism into our engagement process, and that creates barriers. And so this is why it's critical that when we do this work, that we're using terms the community understands. And I've been in so many meetings where, we have someone will say to a family, well, what are you going to do? What's your plan when the community is in crisis and there's shootings in the community? And the mom will say, well, what are you talking about? Crises? That's not a crisis. So, it's up to us to make sure that we effectively understand how do we engage, and not, which oftentimes we do, which is why you find a lack of engagement, and not use the professionalism and try to professionalize the work, but balance that with what the community needs, so we're understanding how to incorporate those, the proper words to use and still be able to do the work. I think there's, things that work well that we've seen and we've done, culture brokers as a component of the work, that you have someone that is reflective of the community when you're engaging them. And I think that's the biggest challenge with our system is oftentimes, when we go and engage our community, oftentimes doesn't look like the community that we're engaging. But even when it doesn't, we don't really understand the community. So therefore we step, unintentionally into time bombs that we didn't intend to. Like when we call an African American mother by her first name, that is like taboo, right? And that just creates barriers. So yeah, there's a lot of great things that we can learn from how to better engage our communities, particularly around mental health. And I think also as systems, when we think about who we're funding to do this work, and I think that's the other systemic racism that we deal with as communities of color, as providers of color. Oftentimes the resources aren't as broad and as deep as, the organization that's right across the train tracks, that's getting, most of the contracts and most of the money to do the work, but it's oftentimes ineffective.
Right. All right. Thank you so much. And just really, I want to kind of finish up by thanking all of you again. Lots and lots of requests also for recordings of this webinar. And so I know that the things that you spoke about are going to be spread far and wide. And so thank you. I also want to thank the Department of Healthcare Services for sponsoring this webinar series. And I want to thank all of you who attended.